Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. It's Open Line First Monday, and my guest tonight has appeared on the program a couple years ago, right?
Right.
And actually some neat things have happened in his life since then. I'll have him share in a moment. But this is that opportunity at the beginning of each month when you are a particularly important part of the program. Every week we do our best to include your phone calls and emails, but we're not always able to get them all in. And I know from the emails and letters that I receive that some of you do have questions that you wish you had been able to pose to one of the guests. So tonight, it's your opportunity. We will use as much time tonight for your questions for the guest. And again, the 800 number is 1-800-221-9460. So you can start calling even now to pose your question or send us an email at journeyhome@EWTN.com. Now, there's no theme per se, as there usually is on a Journey Home program for this Open Line First Monday. We'll have a couple questions here to prime the pump a bit, but it's whatever question you might have about Christ, about His church, and about the journey of following Christ into His church. So tonight I'd like to welcome Ned South. Ned was he'll tell your story in a bit, but he was an Anglican clergyman who converted to the church, how many years ago now?
3.5.
3.5.
Right.
Connected
Right.
to this very program in one way. Right. But tell us a little bit about what has in fact changed.
Well, 3.5 years ago, I came to the network and worked with the pilgrimage department. Enjoyed my work tremendously, but last year I had an opportunity to move into another dynamic within the network, and I'm now the program acquisitions manager for the network. I get all the programming for the network that's outside our own productions.
Yeah.
I love it. It just...
Well, actually, that's an exciting part, too, because EWTN is always looking for new new productions other than the ones that we do ourselves across the room there over in the in the place where all the series are filmed right across the room on the other side. But and, of course, the audience, you don't realize, I don't think quite so clear, that we always have a little bit of an audience for the Journey Home program. There is a group of folk out here watching us, and so if you happen to be in the area, you're always invited to view the Journey Home program, and it just makes the guest a whole lot more comfortable to know not only that there's a bazillion people out there watching you, but that there's some folk right here in the audience, right?
That's right. In fact, the group that's here tonight was a group of Tom Shrewsbury, who used to come on a regular basis, and I'm very fond of.
Well, why don't we begin, as we usually begin on this episode, is give the audience a bit of a reminder of your journey into the church.
Okay. I was an Episcopalian for the better part of 64 years, almost 30 of which I was an ordained minister, and had a series of wonderful Orthodox parishes, 3 of them in Alabama, then 1 in Northeast Ohio. And in 1996, a number of events came to kind of coalesce for me, to force me to deal with the issue of the Episcopal Church and my relationship to it. Had to do with authority primarily, who was in charge of the church. There seemed to be a series of events within the church, such as ordination of practicing homosexuals or same-sex marriages. There was a major embezzlement within the Episcopal Church, which seemed to be tied into the times. It was sort of nobody's in charge. Myself and 5 other Episcopal clergy persons presented a paper to the church at large in which we cataloged, it was called a catalog of concerns, cataloged all the events of the church, hoping to bring about a reformation within the Episcopal Church. Unfortunately, it didn't do anything. It did not help. But shortly after that, I decided to go ahead and take my retirement. My wife, Lee, that same year I retired, became a Catholic herself in our parish. And that's a wonderful story of its own.
She's been on the...
Right.
She's been on twice.
That's right.
It was your turn again. That's right.
And I decided that year that it was time to make some decisions about the church. And in order to do that, I needed to retire, which we did. Moved back down south and spent that better part of early '97 in looking at my options, who I was and where I was, and decided I had to to fish or cut bait, and I had to make the decision: was I going to stay in the Episcopal Church? Was I going to stay as an ordained clergy person, or was I going to make a total cut and deal realistically with what my feelings were? Well, I decided to make the cut, renounced my orders, and came in Easter of 98, Easter of 98.
And you were on here not all that long
Right.
after that, right?
Right. Almost the same time, as a matter of fact.
That's right. We receive, after every time I have an Anglican clergy convert on the program, a number of emails, letters, phone calls from particularly Anglicans, Episcopalians, not always happy with the imposition, is that the right word, by the convert of the differences between the Episcopal and the Catholic Church. Many will say there's no difference. We are Catholic.
Right.
They will claim, they may say, other than a couple minor theological differences, there really is no major differences. And also they will then say, they will say, I don't see any reason why I should consider converting to the Catholic when I'm already Catholic.
Right.
Why don't you address that issue? Because in fact, you made the jump.
Right. Well, actually, it's an easy issue to address because I was there. I was what would be referred to as a Catholic Anglican, high theology of the sacraments, and believed very, very firmly that Catholic, meaning universal, which it does, included the Anglican Church as a part of the overall fabric of God's plans for Christendom. However, there are major differences. The essential doctrines of Eucharist and of authority are so significantly different that you cannot hold on to the Anglican Episcopal understanding of that without being in conflict with what is taught by the Catholic Church. They are significant, and there's no way you can avoid it.
Right. I mean, we can enumerate those. I mean, maybe let's address one or two that I know we constantly get questions on. Let's just for example, the Eucharist.
Well, the Eucharist, traditionally by the Anglican Church, is defined as real presence, which can mean kind of whatever you want it to mean. For years, there was discussion, there was dispute within the Anglican communion about how you responded to God in worship, and that could be low, broad, or high. Well, all of those tied in essentially to Eucharist, in my understanding of it. And if you were high churchman, you had a high understanding of Eucharist as not just real presence, but the body and blood of Christ. In fact, there is room to believe that within the doctrine of the Church. It's just that it is so widely defined, so loosely defined would probably be a better word, that it really doesn't say the reality of what the Catholic Church has always said. This is the body and blood of Christ. The first Book of Common Prayer of the Anglican Church in 1549 did say that. This is the body of Christ. This is the blood of Christ. It got modified in 1552 and in subsequent editions. It became pretty much what you wanted to believe it to be.
In fact, there is an email we can go right to. It goes right with that. It's almost exactly that question, but maybe it might, to see if there's something else you need to add. This comes from Jean. When a family member recently left the Catholic Church and joined the Episcopal Church, there was confusion concerning the Episcopal Eucharist. According to this family member, it is the same as the Catholic Eucharist. I did not agree. Could you please clarify this issue? Well, maybe describe that, having been on the receiving side as an Anglican clergyman that received Catholics going in that direction. Why would this person perceive it as the same, and maybe, again, this distinction?
I think that you can respond in two general terms, probably. But let me say that I think that one who moves from Catholicism to any other portion of the body of Christ, but most essentially to the Episcopal Church, tends to do so because there is a lack of authority. There is a way you can believe what you want to believe without appearing to be heretical. There is also a looseness in authority that is not present in the Catholic Church. I don't believe that anyone who makes that transition from Catholic to Episcopalian probably does that with some exception, as a deliberate move. I think it is done out of a lack of understanding of what the difference is between the two liturgies and between the two sacraments.
Probably in that circumstance, I don't know this person, of course, that we're talking here specifically, but again, given my own experience, having been a Presbyterian pastor and received many Catholics who converted to Presbyterianism, that what I found is that, as I especially look back, is that many of the Catholics who left sadly did not know their faith very well.
Right.
So if they come from Catholic to the Episcopal Church and say there's no difference here, well, that bespeaks of a couple things. One, they didn't know their Catholic faith as well enough to discern the differences. Right. And sometimes when they come into Episcopalianism, first of all, looks very much, smells and bells can be very much the same.
Correct. Right.
It can look the same, it can sound the same.
Much of the liturgy sounds the same.
Much of the liturgy. And plus the use of that phrase, real presence, can be a bit deceptive. Is that not true? Because even what you said, the original Book of Common Prayer, it is the body and blood of Christ. Well, the Lutherans say that, and they don't mean the same as Catholics either. So there are Presbyterians that say the real presence is there, but in a spiritual, mystical, mysterious way.
Right.
So we've got to be careful with our use of terms.
Right. I think one of the other dynamics for move from the Catholic Church to the Episcopal Church or to any other sometimes has to do with the ability to be remarried in the Church. If a Catholic family member has been divorced, separated through some means like divorce, wouldn't be death, of course, and wish to be married in the Episcopal Church, there is a mechanism for doing that. It's much easier than it is within the Catholic Church, and so you avoid having to deal with that process.
Well, this actually gives you a good jumping place and to deal again with this issue of authority, because that was not always the case in Anglican Episcopal circles. That wasn't the theology. Talk a bit about the change and how that could happen.
The canonical requirements for remarriage after divorce were very stringent up until 1970, and it was either in 67 or 70 the canons were changed to permit remarriage after divorce without using the specific impediments to marriage as a means of obtaining the annulment process. Essentially, they were probably very similar to the requirements within the Catholic Church. There's got to be a valid impediment. You just cannot dismiss a marriage as invalid. It has been signed and signified by God in Jesus Christ to be permanent.
Well, in the Catholic Church, just a second, the Catholic Church does not believe in divorce.
Right.
What it does is it checks whether that marriage was in fact a sacred marriage.
Correct.
Is that comparable to the way the Anglican Church was up until the 1970s?
Right. Right. And if there were an valid impediment, then the bishop could permit that to be the means for having remarriage in the Church. But after that canonical change, and which was really a significant sign of the times.
Yeah.
You're talking about the 60s and the 70s when you began to get the old Blue Eyes song sort of thing of I did it my way, and the ability to believe what I want to believe and to act the way I want to act. It was in that period of time that a lot of clergy in the Episcopal Church were divorced and remarried themselves.
Right. Even bishops.
Right.
Yeah, sadly.
Correct.
But I mean, when we're talking about the differences in the churches, I mean, right now we're looking square at one of the most significant issues, because in the history of the Anglican Church, I mean, it's true also back in the 1930 Lambeth Conference. I mean, you have the Anglicans leading the way with the issues of contraception. Isn't that true?
Right. 26 or thereabouts.
26. So let's issue this question I've heard recently, and that is, well, who's running the Anglican Church? I mean, we know who's in the position of authority in the Catholic Church, but what did the Queen of England say? People can divorce now and get remarried, or how does it work in the Anglican Church?
Well, the Archbishop of Canterbury is the spiritual head of the Anglican Communion. The spiritual head has no canonical authority to rule on anything. Within each national portion of the Anglican community, there's a presiding bishop and a House of Bishops. They're the ones who are to be the guiding factor, along with the House of Deputies, to determine the canonical requirements for that area, that country. And that, in fact, I think, has been one of our major problems, is that nobody wants to accept responsibility.
In the Anglican Church.
Right. It's that sense of let's all be happy. Let's all love each other. Can't we all just get along? And that permits people to believe things that are not consistent with Orthodox theology. It is heterodox. It is just not a part of the tradition as it has been handed down. And the bishops wouldn't stand up for it, which is what finally confronted me with, what do I do with this?
It comes down to truth. Is there a truth that is eternally true about divorce and remarriage?
Right.
Is there something that's true about the real presence of Christ?
Right.
Body, blood, soul, and divinity in the Eucharist. And does one determine that by a democratic vote? And in reality, what you see happening is it not true in both
Yes.
the Anglican Church as
Right.
well as it was in the Presbyterian Church, as is true of all democracies.
Right.
Is that when there's a vote, you also have the lobbying
Right.
of the minority voices that want to press the majority.
Oh, absolutely. Democratic theology is a non sequitur. Who is in charge, the democracy or God in the theology? And unfortunately, what happens is that we give way to the pressures and desires of mostly a minority, and give in. That's destructive. That's heterodox. That's just not the way it is.
One of the, I think, considered discomforting comments that I receive from clergy, Protestant clergy who want to convert to the church, is that sadly, it might be a priest or it might be another person in the church will tell them, there's no mandate anymore to come home to the Catholic Church. Ever since Vatican II, just stay where you are.
Right.
But given the differences that you clearly defined between the Episcopal Church and the Catholic Church, talk a bit about the mandate, because you made the jump.
Right. I think the mandate depends on where you are in that journey. At some point in your journey, you come to the position that you acknowledge that this is right and this isn't. And it may be on the presence it may be the reality of the Eucharist, maybe the authority of the Church, it may be the whole nature of the sacraments, but whatever it is, you come to a position that this is true. Mm-hmm. The minute you come to that decision, this is true, and I believe it to be true, I'm confronted with, what am I going to do with it?
Yeah.
I can either be honest with myself and make that jump, or I can hedge and say, I'm just not ready to do that. And sometimes that's true. Or I can say, I believe it, but I'm just not going to change. And I couldn't function that way. It had to be all or nothing.
Yeah, let me take just a second in here to put a plug in for the Coming Home Network. I don't do that very often in the program, but in some ways that is the very issue. Why the Coming Home Network exists, to stand beside Protestant clergymen, because many of them, through their own study, through the discussion outside of the Coming Home Network, maybe by watching EWTN and Journey Home or the Angelical Live and other programs, they come to the conviction that the Catholic Church is true, historically, biblically, philosophically. But then they recognize, now what am I going to do? My wife wants something to do with it. What about my children? What am I going to lose my job? And so part of our work is, just as you said, it's a timing issue.
Right.
Where are they at in their journey, to help them discern God's call in their life, because it can be difficult.
You're absolutely correct. And I was just thinking, one of the options that is taken too often, and has been true in the Anglican Church over recent years, and is obviously true within Protestantism, is it's easy to set up another church. Yeah. I don't believe that in the church I'm in, and I know this is right over here, but in the meantime, I'll do this, and that's schism, and schism cannot be the right way to go. But I know a lot of my friends have done that.
Yeah, I know. So let's take this next email. This comes from Leslie, a fellow convert. Dear Marcus and Ned, As a convert, I hear so many converts who are on fire for God. Have you or the guest ever experienced spiritual dryness since converting? How would a 4-year-old convert work through this? Thank you, Leslie. I've never experienced dryness. Go ahead, Ned.
Yeah, right. My dryness is right here. That's absolutely true. But I reflect back on my years as an Episcopalian and as a minister, and it is always true, I think, that those who come into the church from a different denomination have an enthusiasm that the cradle Episcopalians or cradle Catholics just don't have. Yeah. And it can be contagious and it can be really helpful, or it can be a real turnoff. But my experience has always been that that's good. Yeah. My own journey, I think I think I went through a peak at my conversion. I went into a valley and then came back out of that when Lee and I went into Teams of Our Lady, which then gave us some foundation and refoundation of a prayer life and a spiritual life that was tremendously helpful. And that's a part of our life today. Yeah.
Something I found with this, and maybe you can comment on this also, is that the beauty of Catholic spiritual teaching is that finally I found a balanced theological understanding of dryness.
Right.
You see, from my Protestant background, we had all kinds of interpretations of what it meant if you went spiritually dry, and you're not putting enough time into it, you're reading the wrong things, something wrong with your faith, God's trying to tell you something, trying to zap you from some unconfessed sin way back when. But the reality is that Catholic spiritual theology helps us understand that sometimes dryness is exactly where God wants us to be at that time. It's trying to get our attention, to move us along spiritually.
And what is interesting is that the Church Fathers and the Dark Night of the Soul sorts of writing, I've always been a part of the corpus of Anglican theology and understanding. And yet we don't interpret or interpolate, put it into ourselves what they're really saying. If those who read the Church Fathers were serious about reading and understanding, how could they not make the move?
That's right. That's exactly right. I mean, how many of the converts come about as a result of reading the great Church Fathers? And in terms of solutions for dryness, of course, Mother Angelica talks so much about ways in which moving ahead in our spiritual life. I mean, it's one of the greatest things that she's able to address in her programs. And usually the simplest answer she gives is just talk to Jesus. Just talk to Jesus. And accept that the dryness might be a bit of discipline from the Lord, or just a stepping back. John of the Cross talks about that, moving back a bit to let us there experience the dryness. Because where we're going to turn? We're going to turn to something else, or we're going to keep turning to Jesus. That's the call, and trusting that He'll be there. Then we have another email. This comes from Gabe. I am a member of the United Methodist Church and feel the call of God on my life to enter full-time Christian service. I believe this service is in the area of pastoral ministries, and I am currently enrolled in a strictly evangelical Bible college seeking a Bachelor of Arts in Pastoral Ministries. Are there any types of ministry in the Catholic Church other than the priesthood that are considered full-time? I believe that the Catholic Church has very many solid doctrines, and I am a seeker, but God cannot be leading me down two separate roads. What do you suggest for me? Now that's interesting. That last comment is interesting. God cannot be leading me down two separate roads. The reason it's interesting because a lot of converts, clergy, struggle with that very issue. I mean, what were you telling me back 20 years ago when you called me to be a minister, and now you're calling me to be a Catholic, which may mean sacrificing all that. But what are the opportunities for ministry?
I think probably, I'm not sure I can give a qualified answer. I know I can't give a qualified answer, but it depends on several factors. Is he married? There are the religious orders. There are the right here at EWTN, the order. We've got all sorts of opportunities. But I think that there are some lay organizations also. I don't know, the Christian Brothers, a lay organization or not, or a combination. But there are lots of, he just needs to talk to someone.
There certainly is and this is what the gentleman needs to examine and recognize, that the understanding of full-time ministry is a bit different in the Catholic Church than in the Protestant world in many ways. The Protestant world is full of parachurch organizations, separate independent Christian groups that have no real authoritative umbrella. They're just out there and they're all over the place. We don't find it in the Catholic Church quite so well. But one of the books that I would strongly recommend to you reading is John Paul's letter called Christa Fidelis Laity, or the lay people of Christ. And it is a wonderful description of the apostolate of the laity. And in that book, it emphasized so clearly the frontline ministry of laity in the Catholic Church. And basically, he's saying in that laity don't need to wait around until they get permission.
Right.
Just do it. I
Right.
mean, there's so many opportunities for service in the church
Right.
to just take our initiative and serve the Lord, being faithful, to, of course, within the umbrella of the church. Another difference that I thought would be good before we take a break pretty soon, how many sacraments do the Anglicans?
Well, that's interesting. There are
Catholic Church says 7.
7, right. The Anglican Church says there are 2 required for salvation, baptism and Eucharist, and 5 so-called sacraments, which are not a part of the gospel requirement, they say. But that's like saying they're sacraments or they're not sacraments. You're either pregnant or you're not pregnant. You know, it's you can't be both. You know, and so
they would say is that these 2 are necessary for salvation,
correct. But the other
beyond
5,
that,
right? You know, and which is interesting. And a part of the argument is it is not validated within Scripture or within the Gospels, when in fact you can argue that is not so. And the Catholic tradition has been that it is either through the Gospel or through tradition. You know, so it's.
If you take the 7 that before the Anglican split in the 16th century, the 7 were there in their understanding, and now the Anglicans, Episcopalians have 2, Eucharist and baptism, right?
Right.
Would you say by looking at the 7 that in all cases, all 7 have gone through doctrinal modification to a lessening degree of their importance?
Probably not. I would guess that the intent of whatever the sacrament is has not changed. I think what has changed in transition from 1549 prayer book or whatever it was, which did have all the sacraments,
Is that right?
to now is that one can place less importance on these, as the other 5 at least.
I guess I was looking at the 7. No, you have the sacrament of marriage.
Correct.
Of course, now you look at it where it's moved in the areas of divorce and remarriage. You look at the sacrament of orders.
In that sense, absolutely
in this sense,
correct.
now
right.
in there we have the ordination of women, so that has
Correct.
gone through a change.
Correct. That's true. I wouldn't.
What about
that,
confession?
right.
The sacrament of confession. I mean,
it's always been there, auricular confession, and I used to exercise it regularly within my parishes, and had people who always did it. But most people feel that the general confession that is incorporated into the Eucharist is more than adequate.
So it's
they don't need to.
Kind of a watering down
That's
in that
true.
sense.
That's true.
And the Eucharist, it's moved from being a transubstantiation to being,
correct.
Kind of a vague understanding.
Right.
And maybe even baptism. Has there been some lessening of that?
Probably not.
Well, the reason I say that, there
it's-
was a time, for example, in all the churches that you had to be a baptized member to receive the Eucharist.
Oh, that's true.
That's still
That
true?
is still true.
Although I
right.
know that now you've got
Right.
shared Eucharist with other denominations.
Well, the only shared one that I can remember now is the Lutheran.
Okay.
And that's so similar in sacramental understanding and orders that there's probably not a big difference in that.
Okay.
But as far as baptism is concerned, I would guess that there has not been a lot of change in that. But preparation for baptism has changed. Right. It is no longer of the essence of baptism. You can just do it on a Sunday morning. Although there are priests who are ministers who are just very, very intent on doing education about that. So it's not across the board.
What about the teaching of the meaning of baptism? I've seen this back and forth between its emphasis as a cleansing from original sin,
right.
or as becoming a part of the community,
Right.
or the rite of passage, and you see this back and forth.
That's probably both.
Has there been a shift there?
But I don't think it's a significant shift. I think that the predominant theology of entrance into the body of Christ and the washing away of original sin is still there. Right. Certainly liturgically.
Okay, we're going to take a break. We'll be back in just a moment with your questions for Ned South, particularly maybe on the issue of the difference between Anglicans and Catholics. See you in a moment. Welcome back to the journey home. We're having a good time here with my guest, Ned South. I joking with him earlier said this program is going to go south tonight, but it's been doing just fine. We've been enjoying our time together. And I appreciate your questions, putting them on the proverbial hot seat. But that's what you're here.
That's what I'm paid for.
But I mean, when you chose to make
Right.
the jump, that's part of the things that we recognize.
Right.
And I think that's a important thing we accept when we're called in this day and age. In fact, sadly, the day and age is not Protestant Catholic, but it's more indifferentism.
Right. I think that's true.
It doesn't
I think it's
matter
true.
anymore.
Right.
And that's really the issue. To take a stand and say there is a true church today,
Right. You're going to be criticized.
you're going to be criticized from all angles.
Right.
So let's take our first caller. This is Andy from Florida. What's your question for us tonight?
Yeah, my question for Ned is, what was his view of the Pope as an Anglican versus now? The Anglican Church recognized the Queen, I guess, as head of the Church, and was it difficult to switch that allegiance from the Anglican viewpoint to the Catholic viewpoint?
Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Andy. That is a good question. Interestingly enough, the Anglican-Roman Catholic dialogue, which was very prominent back in the 70s, and probably a late part of the 60s, came to the conclusion of both the Anglicans and the Roman Catholics, who were theologians in dialogue, that there was no reason not to accept the role of the Pope as Bishop of Bishops, which historically it has always been. That raised a furor within probably mostly the Church of England, but also among Anglicans, Episcopalians here, because it seemed to be saying, well, we're ready to make a move, and we're gonna give ourselves into the Roman Church, and the argument was that would throw aside all the tradition and all the growth of the Episcopal Church. Well, that's debatable, but for me, the issue boiled down to one of authority. Who is in charge? We've got an email here that might address that. In fact,
Waiting in it.
yeah, that really does talk
Burning
to
for an answer
exactly
here, yeah.
what Andy's talking about.
That's right. That's right. And it was interesting that you would say that at the time the dialogues had accepted the Pope as Bishop of Bishops,
Right.
similar to the Orthodox view.
I'm not sure. I don't know.
You know, one among equals.
No, that is a term that has been used. Right.
Okay, so
Right.
there's a sense in which that can lead
Right.
one to recognize his pinnacle position,
Right.
or one to downplay, right? Which is where
Right. Or
majority of
right.
Episcopalian
Right.
Anglicans.
Right.
He's one among many.
Right. Or more equal than equals. You know, there are different ways of
All right.
putting it.
Well, speaking of that, we take this next email. It comes from Scott, and he says, a certain retired ECUSA bishop recently spoke in our area, and he's being very elusive here, but that's all right. He denied the resurrection, the incarnation, ascension, etc., etc. How is it that the Episcopal Church tolerates such a person continue to call himself bishop?
This answers your question too, Andy, as to what I had to do. Confronted by people like this, who will remain nameless, I had to make the answer to the question, who is in charge? Yeah. Who has authority? In this case, this bishop, for years and years, promulgated heterodox theology. And nobody in the House of Bishops, other than occasional verbal reprimands from other bishops, the House of Bishops never did anything about it. You know, he was not ever called to holiness, never called on the carpet for what he did. Very personable guy, very loving guy, but you know, I know lots of people who are like that and don't believe anything that's worth a whit understanding. And this is exactly what that is. But the question comes down to who's in charge. Is a bishop like this, who by the very nature of who he is represents much of the Episcopal Church, is this to be what I'm following? Or is it to be someone who is backed by a magisterium and a body of authority that I can stand up with and say, this is right? Well, that's finally what I had to do.
Out in front of of many Lutheran universities, you'll find a statue of Luther. Out in front of many Presbyterian universities, you find a statue of Calvin. Do we find out in front of many Episcopalian schools a statue of Henry VIII?
No, I don't think that's ever happened. That's
whatever happened. What do Episcopalians do with the founder of their faith?
Oh, they ignore him. But I think historically one needs to understand what actually was going on. Henry VIII did not have a male heir. They had come out of the 100 Years' War, the War of the Roses, and it was his intent not to get back into the Civil War again. It was terrible. And I think that his libido got tied up with his political concerns and he went overboard. But the intent of what he was doing was to maintain the monarchy and peace in England. It didn't happen, obviously. Well, it did to some extent, but it caused the schism in the church.
Yeah, you know, the radical natures when you see about this idea that one lie leads to another lie. I mean, his decision to do that, and then what was imposed on everyone in England.
Right.
And I mean, it's amazing on what that one decision.
Well, that one decision is fateful for one particular reason. If you did not swear allegiance to Henry, including the clergy, you had to leave the country. You became a non-juror, a non-swearer. But if you stayed, you gave allegiance to Henry and to the church as it stood under Henry. That meant you forswore papal authority. And you became schismatic. You split from the body that had been the reality, who you were and why you existed, the Catholic Church. Schism begets schism, and look at the divisions that have happened within Protestantism over 500 years. It is horrendous.
When I was in seminary, I did my minor theology on the Puritan Fathers.
Right.
And one of my favorite was a writer named Richard Baxter, who wrote a book called The Reformed Pastor, which had been printed in 1650. And there he was 100 years later trying to reform the clergy of England because it had gotten so far off. And he makes the comment in that book, it's a sin when a man becomes a pastor before he's a Christian. You know, he's making that statement 100 years after the Anglican Reformation. I mean,
he could have made it back in the 60s. I can think of lots of people I knew in seminary who were there because of Vietnam and were hoping to develop a call.
Hoping it would drop on them.
Right. But I don't think a lot has changed in those 400 years.
Let's take our next caller. This is Mark from Minnesota. Hello, what's your question for us tonight?
Well, my question has to do with John Henry Newman, and I wonder if there was any studying of Newman that went on before you decided to convert to Catholicism. I'm just wondering if that had any bearing.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. John Henry Newman, Cardinal Newman, was one of the prime movers and authors of the Oxford movement in England.
150 years ago.
Correct. And he, along with a number of other men, saw the state of the church and issued a number of papers to try and bring about conversion and correction within the Episcopal Church, within the Anglican Church. It unfortunately didn't work, like my thing 5 years ago in trying to bring about reform in the Episcopal Church. But I never realized the parallel, myself and Cardinal Newman. And he made he just couldn't handle it any longer. Got so far into understanding the nature of the church that he could not help but make the conversion. And that's, he is a model for many of us who look for truth.
That's an interesting thought too, because and I thank Mark for that question, because Newman has such an influence on so many. I mean, his books,
not just Anglicans.
His books were key to my own conversion. But what do most Anglicans, Episcopalians do with Newman? I mean, with his writings, because
they read them and they honor him. The movement, the Oxford movement, was very important in the history of the church, and it's studied, but the lessons learned from it sometimes seem to get lost in the shuffle.
But what about, so they just discount
the conversion,
the answer to the problem that he addressed. All right. This next email from Malia says, Dear Ned, how did your family, specifically your children, react to your conversion?
Oh, they were fine because they'd already gone through it with Lee. They thought it was neat. They had been on a pilgrimage with us and before us on their own. They had a really good understanding of what we were about. They have not converted yet, and it is our prayer daily that one of these days they do that. But they're wonderful, wonderful people.
In fact, I was wondering, we had Lee on not too long ago. My wife Marilyn joined Lee and Dale talking about the struggle of clergy wives.
Right.
And my wife represented the aspect of coming in right with her clergy husband. She came in with me. And Dale represented coming in after, but Lee came in before you.
Right.
What was it like being a clergyman with your wife being a Catholic?
It didn't bother me at all. I was the active rector of a church at that time up in Ohio. And I know Lee, and I knew what she was struggling with, and there could not have been another answer. It was the most logical and spiritual thing that she could do. I was for it 100%. I thought it was super. And I was very courageous.
Your congregation?
Most of them bought it and thought it was neat. Those, as Lee said, who didn't like her anyway, this didn't endear them to her. But at that point, she had to deal with that herself, and she did.
Yeah. Let's take our next email. This comes from Bonnie. How do Episcopalians view the great St. Thomas More and his refusal to bow down to Henry VIII and his demands?
It depends on who you are. I St. Thomas More is awesome, and a courageous speaker of truth. But I think he's widely read historically, but ignored.
Yeah. I one time was speaking to one of the men I most admired my whole life, and that's my father. And I was asking him who. If he were to look back in the 16th century of all the key figures, who he would follow.
Right.
And the first thing came to his mind was Thomas More.
Yeah.
And his reasoning was because he was a man of conscience, followed conscience. But it is also interesting that a lot of people who know More, have seen a man of all seasons, don't realize to what extent he was an apologist for the authority of the Holy Father.
Right. Absolutely. Absolutely.
I mean, that's what it was all about.
Right. And you either buy into the authority, again, that whole issue that keeps coming up time and time again, you either buy into that or you ignore it. If you put it aside, what are you, an anarchist? I'm not sure what the answer is, but you can't ignore it and get away with it.
Yeah. Let's take our next caller, Judy from Missouri. What's your question for us tonight?
Hi, Marcus. I'd like to know what a parent can do with children who have turned Episcopal and they're age 30. All I do is pray for them. Is there anything else I can do? Yeah,
they're a bit old to put over your knee, but thank you, Judy. What's your suggestion?
Oh, I think that it's a tough question. It depends on a whole bunch of things. I think what you can do, Judy, is pray. And you offer up your prayers, do the rosary. Our Lady is prominent in assisting with situations like this. But there is no easy answer. I think if you intervene, you probably cause more dissension than you do healing. But that doesn't mean that you diminish your own walk in the Catholic Church at all. I think it must be very prominent. But I'm not sure what else can be said.
In the Coming Home Network, we deal with so many converts from so many different denominations. And on the one hand, we sometimes think that the most difficult conversions are those who are Assembly of God pastors or Church of Christ pastors or Nazarene pastors, because they're coming from backgrounds where they don't have a lot of information in historical background to make them to make the decision. But in some sense, it's almost harder from an Anglican.
Because
Catholic,
you think you've got it.
Yeah.
And if you think you're there and you don't need to make the change because I'm as Catholic as you are, then you don't, until you get honest about the differences.
Yeah.
And then you can't sit on that via media fence any longer.
Right. You mentioned via media. That's important. What is the Via Media?
The Via Media is the Elizabethan settlement for the position of the Church of England vis-a-vis Protestantism. And the Via Media is, we're the middle way. We don't believe this, but we do believe this. You can't blame us in this area, and you can't blame us in this area. We're in the middle. And it's like sitting on a very sharp fence. You can't do it for very long and get away with it. It's, you believe in something or you believe in nothing, as it has been said. And I think that's true. You either take a position on something that has some legitimacy and has some back to it, or you give it up and don't believe anything.
And in fact, that was Newman's quest in the Oxford movement,
Right.
and eventually what drew him to the Catholic Church.
Right.
Let's take our next email. This is to Jesus through Mary from D in Ohio. Dear Marcus and Ned, as Catholics, we accept Our Lady's Immaculate Conception because the Church has defined it as such. What were Ned's views on the Immaculate Conception and other Marian doctrines before his conversion?
That's a great question. Thank you for that question. As I began my journey into the Church, the Marian doctrines were probably the biggest stumbling block for me. And at one point I said, well, I can handle the Assumption of Mary. And my rationale was, if Jesus is going to take anybody into heaven, who's he going to take first? Well, his mother. So that wasn't a problem. But the Immaculate Conception, I couldn't find rationalization for until I said to myself, you believe or you don't believe. You accept the authority of the magisterium or you don't. The magisterium of the Church has said this is so, and that's good enough for me. So I had to go on faith on that doctrine. But I have no problem with it.
And it really fits with Augustine's idea. I think it was Augustine, if he wasn't repeating others, and that is faith often precedes understanding.
Correct.
Is that right?
Right.
And so in some of these hard areas, you accept the truth, and then from that position, you examine then the data from the position, and then comes understanding. Because then, from that perspective, the Immaculate Conception makes sense when you understand her as the Ark of the Covenant, and there's lots of
all
reasons.
those wonderful litanies that speak of the role of Mary. We had been doing the Rosary for years, and there are many Anglicans, Episcopalians, who've always done the Rosary, and I think that's probably one of the steps forward to understanding more of the Marian doctrines. But so that was never an issue. But the only one that was that one issue, and that was worked out.
Here's an interesting email from Carol.
I'm not sure I like that question.
No, I think it's interesting. My daughter, who left the Catholic Church many years ago to become a Baptist, has recently joined an independent Anglican church. Am I correct in thinking she is moving closer to the one true church? Closer.
Yeah, right. Yes, I think that could be rationalized that way. Because it is but I'm not sure how you understand that. Granted, there's a big difference in liturgy, and there is a bigger difference in the understanding of the Lord's Supper and Eucharist
between Baptist and Anglican.
Correct.
On the trajectory to the
whatever
Catholic
this
Church,
other church is.
So independent Anglican. I mean, that's interesting in itself.
Well, that sounds schismatic to begin with, but I'm not sure what she means by that. But yeah, I think you can look at it as a part of the journey, which is what you're so good at. Is answering that from that perspective. Yeah, this is a move.
Because that is that interesting way of trying to align the churches, which is closer and as we mentioned earlier, sometimes when I think about our apologetic work, it's sometimes easier to work with a Baptist to get them to see, because you can just draw those distinctions.
Right.
Once saved, always saved versus the Catholic's understanding of always in conversion, always
on the way,
always on the journey. Where if you get the Anglican Church, you might be closer, but it might be more difficult in some sense to become solidified in their position. And this idea of an independent Anglican Church, because wouldn't it be true that if you went back 100 years ago, there would have been the Anglican Church of England, the Church of England, and then the Episcopal Church of the United States.
Correct.
But in the last 100 years, there's been a great number of spin-offs.
Mostly since the 50s, when some of the arguments with the National Council of Christian Churches, American, CCA, that was probably the first significant schism within the Episcopal Church. And since then, there have been those schisms over ordination of women, the change in the Book of Common Prayer, and now recently the issues over same-sex. So yeah, there are more and more breakdowns. So when she says an independent Episcopal Church, I'm not sure exactly what she's referring to.
All right, we're going to take an email here that I know that they're working on just a format for us, and here we go. We're ready to run with it now. Although I can't, on my monitor, I can't read who it's from. I'll get to them and get down to the bottom. But it says, "Hi, Marcus and guest. You both, as well as other converts, seem to feel that it became obvious to you that the Catholic Church is the church founded by Christ. Yet there are so many Protestants who I believe honestly disagree with this. They have researched, studied, and do not believe Jesus founded one visible church. Why do you think this is? Thanks and God bless," comes from Frank.
Historically, you can't deny it. That's where it started. You know, the Gospels indicate that to be true. You can't separate the gospel truth from reality. There was no schism for 1,000 years. No. You know, it was one church founded by Jesus on the rock, on Peter. And at that point, it was, you know, it couldn't be founded by someone else.
Yeah, it seems to me clear. Newman himself, let's go back
Right.
to Newman, made that statement: to become deep in history is to
Right.
cease to be Protestant. And
Right.
when I look at all the different theories that want to get away from the one
Right.
church idea to some either invisible church idea
Right.
or any other church claiming to be that one church, once they study history,
Right.
all of that comes apart, because some would say that the church got off base immediately and would start teaching things,
right,
you know, that,
right.
or that it was always Congregationalist from the beginning. That's what I used to teach at one point. It was always just a conglomerate of individual churches with completely different, and sadly I see some kind of dissenting Catholic theologians that are trying to
Right.
go in that direction,
Right.
you know, to downplay our differences. But again, you go deep into history and it's there.
And I think every single one that splits like that says they have become the true church.
Yeah.
We've got the answer. This is it.
We've rediscovered it.
Right.
Turned over a rock,
Right.
and there it was.
Right.
Just the wrong rock. They turned over. You know, I found that there were reasons that I became Catholic. But I also discovered after becoming Catholic, after a period of time, I discovered new gems in the church that even solidified stronger why I was a Catholic. And maybe in conclusion, as you look at the reasons you came to the church, but now you've been a Catholic for a while, what have you found that even convinces you more that you're in the true church?
The Pope, I think, Holy Father, is exactly the reason that I stay here. The fact that he is the central authority, focuses authority, the magisterium is a reading of that. That and my understanding of Eucharist, that it is the body and blood of Christ, that feeds me, that keeps me going. It's the only thing that does.
And I think that I couldn't agree more, and in the sense that it was also our coming to a better understanding of how the Holy Father understands himself.
Right.
A servant of servant, a humble man who loves Jesus Christ.
Right.
In any way that I would have understood a servant of Jesus before I was a Catholic, that's our Holy
Lives
Father.
it out.
That's right. Ned, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
It's a real pleasure to fill in. Kimberly was supposed to be with us. Kimberly Hahn was supposed to be with us tonight, but wasn't able to, and you were able to jump in and fill. So thank you very much. Thank you very much.
Enjoy it.
Thank you for joining us on the journey home. It's always a pleasure to be with you. Let's keep each other in prayer, especially during this difficult time in our country. We need to hear the leading of God, to reach out in love and be faithful to his call. God bless. See you next week.